see you, girl. Let's see. Hopefully audio is working. It takes me a minute to get all my equipment set up, so yeah, sorry. So hey guys, welcome to Lifting with Lauren, episode 5. Let me adjust this light here. I actually turned the lights on for once. Save electricity. So I took a poll in my Instagram stories to see what I was going to be talking about today, and the vote was on science of glute training. So I'll give one little caveat here. Even though I have spent a lot of time studying and reading about glutes and training them on my own, sometimes my anatomy words get a little screwed up. So if I mess up the words, don't get mad at me, okay? I'm just, doing the best I can here. All right, I'm good. Okay, so let's see here. We're going to start with this. So I first got introduced to the idea of specifically training the glutes, and probably what year was that? 2014. I had already been into bodybuilding type stuff, so I knew how to do it for the rest of the body, but I wasn't as certain when it comes to glutes. And I think the first time I ever saw the hip thrust, I actually saw Dana Lynn Bailey doing it, and I was like, what the heck is that? So I tried that, which was extremely hard. I think the first time I did a hip thrust, I piled on 85 or 95 pounds, which for someone who's never done it before can actually be a lot, being a small female. And then after that, I think the first article I ever saw on glute training, I was probably on bodybuilding.com, or I was on Facebook, because back then Facebook was still sharing the posts of fitness people more, so you were able to actually read their blogs and stuff, because now the algorithm is totally screwed up and you can't do that. But back then you were still able to read everybody's stuff, and I saw an article that I think was on Dr. Brett, he wasn't Dr. back then, but Brett Contreras' blog. It was actually written by someone else. So another person had discovered hip thrusts, I guess, and she was doing it with a plate at home. And she kind of broke down some of the stuff that she saw about hip thrusting. Well, then I discovered Dr. Brett Contreras, and if you know anything about him, he is considered the glute guy. So a lot of what I know about glutes has been from heavily following his content for a number of years. He's put a lot of time and energy into, obviously, training glutes, training his clients that way, and then also doing EMG research on a lot of things, and inventing a lot of exercises. So there's a bunch of exercises that I do now with my clients and myself that I actually got from him. Side note, I don't have to add this in, but it's my podcast, so I'm going to say whatever the heck I want. I don't follow him as closely anymore for personal and ethical reasons, but I still do value a lot of the stuff that he has put out there. So a lot of what I'm saying is coming from him. So the first thing is that I think in general, it's funny to me that in the bodybuilding community, you wouldn't train your glutes heavily, because bodybuilders want to train everything super hardcore, because they want everything to hypertrophy. Why you wouldn't want to specifically train your glutes, I will never understand that. I think I read somewhere that one guy was saying you don't want to overtrain your glutes because, as a bodybuilder, as a man, because it will make your quads look small or something. I have no idea. Anyway, but in the past, the general idea has been, oh, you know what I didn't do? I didn't write down what I was supposed to do, and it's on my phone. Oh well, I'll make it up as I go. In the past, bodybuilders have typically, let me back up a little bit. Sometimes with certain muscles, you can get a passive effect where you are training that muscle, or you're not training that muscle, you're training a different group of muscles, but that muscle actually receives some kind of benefit from it. You can see that sometimes with the calves. So if you're doing squats, for example, I'm gonna see if you can actually see me in this, doing these landmines. By the way, I wouldn't normally be training legs today, but I can't talk about glute training and not train legs. That's what I'm attempting to do here. I'm just changing things up. So you could, like, for example, train squats and your calves would actually see a small effect, I think. And that's only because you're eccentrically working the calves. So whenever you go to squat, you're actually contracting the calves. And because it crosses the ankle joint, as you squat down, you're actually getting an eccentric contraction on the calves. So you could probably see a little bit of calf development from that. Is that going to be significant enough to give you big calves? Probably not, and particularly not if you're a hard gainer like me, or if you just have crappy calf genetics like that. You would need more direct training, and for some reason, for a long time, people have approached training the glutes like that, like it's a passive thing, or like, oh, well, my glutes will get trained when I do like squats and deadlifts and stuff, so why would I need to add in additional training? Like, it's just so weird to me. I mean, you'll see people trying to like literally train their TFL. Your tensor fasciae latae runs like right in here. You will see people actually trying to train that teeny tiny muscle, and your glutes comprise the most volume of muscle in your entire body, okay, compared to any other set of muscles in your body. You wouldn't train that directly. Anyway, okay, so a couple things to note about the glutes. A lot of muscles cross two joints. For example, the biceps cross the elbow and the shoulder. So they help with shoulder flexion and they help with elbow flexion. The hamstrings cross the knee and the hip. So they help with knee flexion and hip extension. The calves, like we were talking about, crosses the ankle joint and the knee joint. So they help with plantar flexion, and they also help with knee flexion. So the way that those muscles cross those joints is different depending on the muscle. So you'll actually see that there's different types of levers. Part of it has to do with like the structure of the actual joint, but also the direction of the pennation of the muscle. So the muscle might be like a biceps tendon, your biceps muscle. Your muscles fibers run pretty much straight. Your deltoid has like some pennation, so your muscle fibers are actually at angles. So that actually changes what the muscle is going to be doing. So for example, and it also is affected by the joint. Let's see here. So for example, the biceps muscle is straight, so it pretty much just does flexion. It doesn't actually, as far as I know, it doesn't contribute to any rotation. Even though you can rotate your forearm and you can rotate your shoulder, the biceps muscle doesn't contribute to that. But the deltoid is pinnated at angles, so it can in your glenohumeral joint, your shoulder joint, is a ball and socket, so it can do all kinds of stuff. Your deltoid can contribute to a little bit of rotation in addition to your rotator cuff muscles, but it can actually do all kinds of different angles and different movements because it's pinnated like that. It helps with like lateral flexion. You can do forward flexion and extension and all that stuff, all the pressing. So because of the nature of the muscle, that's the reason why it has so many functions. So the glutes are like that too. I'm like not really sure what I'm doing here. Hold on. See, I have all my stuff on my phone, and then I didn't get it, and now I'm on a live, so now I can't turn my phone off and get the workout, so I'm having to go off of memory here. So with your glutes, they are pretty similar. Now the glutes are comprised of a bunch of different muscles also. You've got your gluteus maximus, which is a bigger part of your glutes. You have minimus, which is like deeper in there, I think. Glute medius is like up on the top portion. And then you have like other external and internal rotators, and mostly external rotators inside the hip. So your glutes are interesting because as a whole, they actually have three main functions. They do hip extension, they do hip abduction, and then they also do hip external rotation, where you actually rotate out. So because of that, you actually have to train your glutes accordingly. So you have to train all of those different directions of movement. And that's some of the things that Dr. Contreras says. So, for example, I'm squatting now. Let me count so that I don't like lose track of what I'm doing here, since I already don't know what I'm doing. I'm doing a landmine squat to try to keep more upright because I have an issue with my sciatic nerve. I'm trying to not irritate it, and my theory is that this will help. Okay, I don't know how many that was. We'll say 10. So let's see, squatting and deadlifting and hip thrusting are all hip extension style movements. They work in hip flexion and extension, so they're more like a linear type pattern. Things like lying leg lifts, like where you're laying on your side and you lift your leg up. Any kind of like lateral band walks. If you're doing even a side plank is like an isometric version of abduction. Side lying hip raises. Oh gosh, okay. Side lying hip raises are these, where you lift your hip and your top leg and those super suck. Those are all different versions of hip abduction. And then the last one is hip external rotation. So you usually do that one with bands. It could be like like you're sitting and doing abduction with bands. You could be laying on your back and doing that. Any kind of like, it looks like abduction, but you're actually externally rotating. All of those are helpful too. So you should train all three to hit the glutes well. This might go a lot faster than I thought. Let's see here. So let's start with the basics. So if I'm designing someone's program, I do this in general anyway, even if they don't want to train their glutes, because I think that it's necessary. In general, you would select at least one exercise from all three of those quadrants, and that's only if you're doing like a full body program. You would select 3 from quadrants. You see how I said that? 3 from each of those categories. You would select a vertical component, so like some kind of, oh gosh, hold on a minute. Sagittal plane. You would select a sagittal plane movement, so you're either a squat, a deadlift, or a hip thrust. You would select a frontal plane movement, so some kind of abduction thing, and you would select a transverse plane movement, which would be one of your rotational things. That way you would hit all 3 sections of the glutes, and all 3 movement patterns of the glutes. Now, here's the thing about it though. Your frontal plane is obviously going to be the one where you're working the glutes the most. Getting the most EMG activity, getting the most muscle contraction, getting the biggest movement, causing the biggest movement in the body. That's going to be where you get the most of that. So those are going to be the biggest ones. The thing about, I was talking about pennation earlier. So your glutes actually run from in and they kind of teardrop out to the side, kind of, or like, this thing. So because they're kind of at an angle, that's why they have this like hip flexion, but also like a slight abduction. The most ideal range of motion for your leg whenever you are extending is actually not straight back, and plus you have hip flexors that get in the way. It's not actually straight back, it's actually more like a 45-degree angle. So that's partially because of the structure of the glute, or the angle of the muscle thingies. Okay, so let's say, for example, actually, let's break down some of the movements. So since I'm squatting, let's talk about squats. So I know that the common idea is that, hold on, I'm counting. The common idea is that squats will build your glutes more than anything else. And here are all these squat exercises to build your glutes. Not exactly. So, for example, some powerlifters do have really big behinds. Powerlifters are the ones that are lifting really heavy stuff. Some of them don't have as big of butts as people who train them directly. That's because squats are actually a little bit more quad dominant. Whenever you are squatting down, and then kind of when you're coming back up, you're getting a lot more eccentric work on the quads. Now you are getting some work on the glutes too. So part of the theory with a lot of the glute training is that if it activates the muscle more, then it's going to eventually lead to hypertrophy. There's 3 main components that are thought to be part of hypertrophy. One is muscle damage. Another one is time under tension. And the last one is metabolic damage, but that one's being shown to not really be as prevalent. So how much time and how much volume or how much load you're putting on your body, and then also how much muscle damage you're causing in the process are what leads to hypertrophy. So with squatting, you have one of those components. You can squat down and you get that eccentric load where you're actually stretching out through the glutes, but then when you stand back up, by the time you're standing, there's actually no load on the glutes. So you're not getting any kind of EMG activity, or you wouldn't be getting any kind of EMG activity. You wouldn't be getting any kind of major contraction on the concentric portion, the portion where the glutes are actually would be in their most tightened position. So this is stretched out. This is where you're standing up. The standing up position where you would want the most contraction, you're not getting that because your skeleton is actually holding the weight up. So that's an issue there with why you might not see as much glute growth from doing squats. But eccentrics are a huge contributor to hypertrophy. So that one's a little bit kind of up in the air. So the thought is that you use squats as part of a well-rounded glute training program because they will add more muscle damage, and you're going to want that in the long term in order to be able to build your glutes. You need all of these different components. Okay, so there's that one. By the way, the approach that Dr. Contreras takes is a shotgun approach, where you're taking you're trying to hit as many different facets of glute training as possible until we have more research to back it up, because there's really not a lot of research on glute training. So let's see, the next one, let's talk about a deadlift. So obviously there's different types of deadlifts, but the general idea is the same. You're doing a hinge. Now with deadlifting, the glutes are right in the middle of the movement because your hips are going back, your glutes are attached to your back and your leg. So you would think that you would get some kind of work there. There have been some research studies on that. I think there's been more than just EMG research, but EMG, by the way, is electromyography, and all it does is you just hook up some electrodes to your muscle, and they tell you whether or not the muscle is activating or at what capacity they're activating. So you can do it for lots of different types of movements, and a lot of the studies on the glutes have been EMG, but there's not as much. It's not clear how true that is to ultimately leading to hypertrophy. We only have anecdotal evidence of that. So with deadlifts and hinge type movements, this one is kind of tricky because the angle of your load is what matters. So this is one of the coolest things I had ever seen in my life. I read this article back in 2014, and they were comparing the good morning to the the good morning to the 45-degree hyperextension and the 90-degree hyperextension. So good morning is when you're standing, hips go back, you stand up, right? 45-degree hyper is when you're here, you go down, come back up. Same movement, right? Different angle. 90 degrees is where your legs are up here, you go down and come back up. So if I remember the way that they drew these curves correctly, with the good morning, you had almost no glute activity. With the 90-degree hyper, I think you had the most erector spinae and then a little bit of glute and hamstring activity. But with the 45-degree hyper, you had massive glute activity, and part of it was because of the direction of the load. And obviously you can make a little adjustments to the 45-degree hyper to take out the hamstrings even more and to make it focus more on the glutes. And the erectors out, you would have to whatever, I'm not going to get into that. But the angle of that hinge is actually what mattered, which is really cool. So if you take that and apply it to deadlifts, or if you were to even try to, or if you even looked at research with deadlifts, there's not going to be as much glute activity usually with deadlifts. I was reading an article review the other day, and they were actually talking about the hamstrings, which I thought was interesting. This is kind of a side note. They were saying that the hamstrings don't actually get necessarily a lot more activation in the deadlift than they would in the squat. I don't know how that's true, but that's what the research was saying. So with your glutes in a deadlift, generally you are going to have a little more work on the hamstrings. We're going to stick with what is previously said because I'm not sure about that study. You do get that eccentric movement again, but once again, on the concentric, whenever you're standing up, your glutes are in a more relaxed position. So generally, you don't want this squeeze and tuck forward thing that some people will add because it's really not safe for your hips or your back. So don't do that. You just want to come up to a neutral position. You can squeeze at the top and not have that forward movement of the hips. So you can not hyperextend. you could come to here and squeeze. But even with that conscious squeezing, like that's going to help a little bit. Any kind of conscious squeezing is going to help, but it may not necessarily lead to greater glute growth. Gosh, I just realized that I'm also doing an audio version of this and you can't actually see what I'm doing. So on the audio only version, if you're doing a deadlift and you try to like hyperextend your hips by pressing them forward, that's not going to be good for the back. Instead, you could come to a neutral position, you could squeeze your glutes, but it might not necessarily lead to more glute growth. So the way that you make up for that, so that's 2 exercises that are good for eccentric load, but not necessarily for concentric work. So the way that you remedy that is you do the hip thrusts. So the hip thrust exercise and bridging variations have super high glute activity as far as like EMG research goes. Whenever you lift your hips up off of the ground and you push up, first of all, your knees are bent, so you're taking your hamstrings primarily out of it, because if the knees are bent, then the hamstring is already kind of pulled up in the direction of the knee because it's being used to flex the knee. So then it's not going to be used as much for hip extension. Just so you know, if you're utilizing a muscle on one end of its on one end of the body, like if a muscle crosses 2 joints and you're using it more on one joint, it's harder for it to work on the second joint. That's why sometimes you get cramps. So if the hamstring is already used at the knee, then you're able to use just the glutes in order to do hip extension. Plus, if you do it correctly, where you're actually tucking your hips under as you lift, so you're actually getting that posterior pelvic tilt. Posterior pelvic tilt is where the top opening of your pelvis actually tilts rearward, so you get like that sad dog tail tuck thing. Then you're going to have more glute activity. So that's why hip thrusts do a lot for that. So far, there doesn't appear to be any indicators that hip thrusts are inherently damaging. That you could do them incorrectly and possibly damage yourself. But as far as we know, there's nothing that's really a limiting factor with them, just because of the angle of force. So it is a shear force on the hips. But if you angle the body correctly, and then you also have your back supported, that's your lower shoulder blades, I don't know that there's any real damage that can happen to the spine, especially since you're going to be braced. So that's why people load them the heck up. So people will take really, really heavy weight and put it on the hip thrust, and they can do a lot of weight because it's a limited range of motion. I got my Gatorade with my creatine, my steroids. You can really load up hip thrusts and do a lot of them, just because there doesn't appear to be any major issues when they're done correctly, unless for some reason you have some kind of hip issue that's pre-existing. Okay, so that's the linear stuff. So next would be your abduction movements. So the linear movements are going to be hitting primarily the glute maximus. Your glute max is going to be working on all types of movements. It's just that they work more on your linear, like forward and backwards or up and down type movements, axial type movements. On your abduction, they work a little bit, but you're going to get more like glute medius and other muscles that I can't remember the names of right now. So that's why you would start adding in things like your leg lifts. So the thing with their glute max, if I remember this correctly, there's a pretty good mixture of type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. All right, so type 1 muscle fibers are your like endurance type muscle fibers. Those are the ones, they move more slowly. They don't need energy replenished as readily. There's a lizard in here. So in order to work them maybe best, you could do like higher rep ranges. With your type 2 muscle fibers, you are getting more explosive type power. They use more of the ATP-CP energy system, which that's basically energy readily available, fewer than 10 seconds, big strong lifts, like your really heavy lifts, even if they take longer than 10 seconds, that's going to be the ATP system. So your type 2 muscle fibers are going to be what's called your fast twitch muscle fibers, even if it's not technically fast. Any type of heavy load on the body or really intense burst, your type 2 muscle fibers are doing that. So your glute max has a mixture of both of those. Interesting fact is that whenever you're using your type 2 muscle fibers, you work as like, not dimmer switches, but you work on like a, I don't know what this would be considered. You would be engaging your type 1 muscle fibers first, and then you engage your type 2. So whenever you're doing big, heavy lifts, you're actually using both types of muscle fibers. You're not just sticking with just one type of muscle fiber. But still, it is recommended that in order to better work both different types, you have your intense, heavy loaded, lower rep range exercises, but then you also incorporate some lighter load, higher repetition exercises. BT dubs, more and more research is coming out showing that this like optimal range for hypertrophy, that NSCA, NASM, ACSM, American College, ACSM, and all these other certifying bodies, this optimal rep range of like 8 to 12 or 10 to 15 or whatever for hypertrophy, it's not really, no, because all rep ranges can lead to hypertrophy. Does it mean that it's affecting different types of muscle fibers? I don't really know, but every rep range can contribute to hypertrophy, so you should hit all rep ranges. So anyway, that's glute max. I know I'm jumping all over the place. Let me do a set here before I lose track of what I'm doing. So glute medius, I believe does anybody know what number that was? We'll say that this is 7, 8. Okay, I'm starting to feel a little pull in my sciatic nerve here. 9, 10. I'm trying to be better about limiting my range of motion when I feel too much of a pull there. That could be yucky tomorrow. So your glute medius and your abductors are going to be a little bit more type 1 muscle fibers. So you're going to get more into your higher rep ranges, and they end up being more like burnout type movements. You're probably not going to do as much heavy lifting laterally, which I've never seen someone do obnoxiously heavy lifting laterally. You can load it. You can do super heavy bands doing your hip abduction. Some people will do like hip hikes, where you're holding onto something, you're standing up, you've got a plate weight on one leg and your knee is bent, and you're hiking that leg up super high, or you're like holding a kettlebell on there. Or some people will do like the hip abduction machine, which is a little bit more external rotation, but heavy. It's just that your ability is going to be in the higher rep ranges, so you can load your higher rep ranges, BT dubs. So abduction is going to be that way, and then your hip external rotation is going to be a lot more of your seated and knees going out to the side. Let's see. So I'll just throw out some cool facts about glutes, because that's kind of the main stuff when it comes to glute training. Basically just like trying to get a well-rounded approach, trying to hit 3 different types of movement patterns, and then, cycle things out. Lunges also count for glute, for your axial loading, for your like vertical plane stuff. So also how you do those exercises makes a big difference as well. Like I was talking about with glute hip thrusts, you can tuck your hips under at the top and feel a completely different feeling than if you were keeping your back arched. I'm going to actually show that real quick. So if you're not watching the video version of this, you're not going to see it, but I'm going to show it anyway. So if you're doing a glute bridge or a hip thrust, and you hip thrust and your back is arched like that, you're probably not going to feel that as much in that. You're going to cough your brains out. Probably not going to feel that as much in your glutes. That was not a good position. Sorry, just had my head back and started coughing. I felt that more in my hamstrings. Instead, you would actually keep your body more forward, and the best way to get into more glute activity with any exercise is always going to be a bit more of a flexed spine with your hips tucking under. So this actually applies to hyper extensions also. So if you're doing your hyper extensions, this is kind of what your spine and your hips are going to look like. Head forward, sternum down, hips come up, and they tuck under. Let's turn into an instructional video. You guys owe me money. So this type of like rounded hips going under, that's kind of what you're looking for. And you would see that same type of thing with like a 45-degree hyper, is your head's tucked under, hips are kind of tucked under too, and your back is slightly rounded. That way you're getting more hip extension and you're not relying on your spine. So how you do an exercise matters. Same thing with like, so back to lunges. I think some folks say that if your body is more upright with lunges, then you'll feel them more like in the legs. But if your body is more forward with lunges, you'll feel it on the glute of the front hip. I am saying that from other people's experience, not my own, because I have not felt that, but supposedly that's the case. Let's see. So other cool things about the glutes. So because they contribute to so many different types of movement, they're used in almost every type of activity. So I have worked with like elementary and middle school, high school, and college level, and like recreational athletes. And with every single athlete, we always try to train their glutes. So let's talk about a couple different types of sports. Running. So with running, when you run, when you take off from the blocks, or when you're running down the track, you are using your glutes. You're using them, especially also using them on that swing through path. So whenever your foot comes forward and you strike and you swing that leg through, obviously you're using hip extension. That is why Olympic track athletes have big old booties. They may train them, but they're also using them, especially like sprinters. Sprinters is what I'm referring to. I mean, long distance runners are people too. They're athletes too, but I'm thinking about sprinters. Sprinters are going to have big old butts because they're working them intensely. Now, granted, some of them also have really awesome genetics, but that's beside the point. So, sprinters, okay, they're going to be using theirs in that motion. If they're some kind of a jumper, like a high jumper or whatever, they may see some engagement. Some of the stuff that I've seen from jumping, you don't usually get quite as much glute activity. Because once again, you're coming from a squatted position and going up into a vertical position. So you would get like your eccentric work at the bottom of the squat. And then as you come up, you might get some explosive concentric work from the glutes, but you're going to get it mostly from the quads and the hamstrings, particularly the quads. So jumping, not quite as much. Football players or soccer players, or for my UK people, football players, soccer. So those folks are going to have a lot more versatility in how they're using their glutes too. So they get the running part with the hip extension. They get the more vertical stuff with jumping, but then they're also going to get a lot more of the abduction and external rotation type stuff. So if you are cutting from one side to the other, like if you're going to be moving laterally, that's abduction all day long. So you're going to be pushing off and moving your body to the side, which is why it is still good to try to load that position. So rather than just doing slow movements, if you're an athlete, you actually want to try to load that up, get into lower rep ranges and higher weights, because that transfers over in some cases to power production. As long as you're moving. If you're working on like quick movements laterally, you want to try to train that too. So example, so we're talking closed chain now versus open chain. So open chain training is like moving my leg. Closed chain is my feet are on the floor, and that's what your athletes are going to generally be doing. So you could train that. You could put a band on and practice moving quickly side to side wearing a band. So that's going to have your biggest crossover for like a lateral moving athlete. Basketball players, obviously. Next big one is rotating. So if you're cutting and turning, that's another big part. Rotating through the hips. Big one though, particularly, is baseball athletes and different types of throwing athletes. So your glutes contribute very heavily to your ability. I think I just hit my mic, sorry. Your glutes contribute very heavily to your ability to turn and throw. because of the way that they're connecting the upper and lower halves of the body. So if you think about a thrower with their feet on the ground, they're going to be back kind of in a split stance position. They're going to usually take a little bit of a step forward. They're going to start to rotate their hips first. Usually you're going to get that X shape with the upper and lower halves of the body. They start to rotate their hips first. Their hand comes after, and they throw the ball. That rotating pattern they get out of the hips is very heavily dependent on the strength of the glutes and the ability of the glutes to contract and rotate the body. For my karate people who watch this, same thing, rotating in place. You're in front stance doing reverse punches. No excuse to not be training your glutes because they help to stabilize your body. They help to do rotational stuff. Okay, everyday application now that we're going to get past athletes because it just made me think of this. So, still losing track of what I'm doing here, guys, because I didn't write down what I was supposed to do today. So I'm doing wimpy stuff. So if you are just an everyday person and you're like, okay, well, I don't really give two craps about getting a big butt, so why would I need to train my glutes? One reason is actually for overall health and function. So let's say I'm not a doctor, I'm not going to diagnose you, but let's say, for example, people with back trouble. What I have noticed anecdotally with my clients is that if you train your glutes more, because they work with hip extension, which also helps to support the spine, then you will see a big difference, because if the glutes are more active, then you spend a lot more time with these glutes in like this just barely activated position, because help versus people who don't have as much glute control. You'll sometimes see a little bit more slouching, or they may be have just micro changes in their spine, where if they had a herniated disc or whatever, you can go back to the pain podcast I did last week. They might feel that they have more pain in the previous position versus if they start training their glutes, their posture will a lot of times improve. And you'll notice that too. Now, granted, sometimes you'll see women with big glutes and they walk like this. But in general, if you have healthy glutes and you understand body positioning, you'll actually get a pretty neutral pelvis, or you'll get a position that's neutral for your body, which might be more anteriorly tilted, but that's actually okay. Whatever position is comfortable for you. Generally, training your glutes is going to make you feel a lot better when it comes to your back. If you have hip pain, sometimes you'll feel better there. Another thing is with walking. So I don't think people realize, obviously with running, your glutes have you make a big difference. With walking, they do too. And it's not actually just because of hip extension. So when you're walking, yeah, obviously you're extending your hips slightly, but your entire gait is affected. Hold on, I'm counting. I'm trying to not make this entire workout go to waste because I can't stop talking here. I don't know if this is a good idea. I just don't really work out. I just talk the whole time. Hold on. And then I also forget to write down what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm almost there. 9, 10. Okay. Notice I'm only doing 2 sets of everything because I have to keep my volume of training a little bit lower right now until I make sure my recovery is under control. So don't judge me. So with walking, your entire gait is controlled by your glute strength. So there's a slight rotation of your hips whenever you walk. That's part of it. That goes up into the deeper abdominal muscles and stuff too, but in the trunk supporters. But also what's going on with your knees and your feet. So when you walk, your glutes work on stable, which translates to the knee. So whenever you walk forward, this happens a lot with women. Sometimes women will go this way, where their knee will actually fall in. If you're a karate athlete, you see this a lot of times when people start to move forward in a stance. So their knee will actually fall in. That is a good indicator that either they are not conscious of it or their glutes are not firing in order to keep that knee stable. It's going to be your abductors and external rotators. So you will sometimes find that if you train those more, it's easier to keep that knee in place. Now, granted, it could take some actual work on walking, but that's another big benefit. If your knee starts to fall in, or if you don't have as much control of the hip, Sometimes it can go all the way down to the feet. So people who see issues with their feet, where they're flat-footed, or they overpronate, where their foot kind of falls flat, or they have like ankle issues, or they roll their ankle all the time. Sometimes, I mean, it is a foot issue. You got to start with that. But sometimes you can work all the way up toward the hip because you have this rotational thing happening at the hip. Dr. Emily Splickle is like amazing with this stuff. I saw her at an NSCA conference, and she talks about like this rotational type of stuff going on with the body. It's not fascia. It's just what the body, it's just like the muscles attached to each segment of the body. So don't get your hopes up about that fascia stuff. If your foot is falling downward, it could be that, number one, you don't have control of the ankle, but a big part of it could be control at the hip. So it can be a big part, your glutes can be a big part of just everyday, daily walking, doing different activities, lifting things up, overall controlling your posture. So that turned into a little bit of a rabbit trail. But basics of glute training, pick one of three different, not one of three, pick one exercise for each of the different categories for hip extension, for hip abduction, hip external rotation. Train all of them, and train especially your hip extension in different rep ranges, your abduction and rep ranges, and then you want to actually rotate those exercises out. So like ideally you would have like a hip thrust day, a squat day, and a deadlift day, or you could do all of them on the same day, which is like what I just did right now. And then adding in your other things too. Make sure you're monitoring your recovery so that your butt doesn't hurt all the time. My very first exposure to glute training was a glute program that lasted 4 days. It was full body, but it was like heavy glute stuff, like 4 days a week, ultra high damaging type stuff. And my butt was sore for 4 months, like non-stop. It was awful. So I don't recommend constantly training and constantly being sore. You should give yourself a break. It sucks. But then also just kind of remember that it's important to train your booty. It's not just because we like to see big butts. It's because it's good for you. So like I said, big rabbit trail. Let's see if there's any questions. No. Okay. Oops. Well, anywho, thank you guys for sticking around. AKA, hey Charlotte. And if you have any requests for what I talk about and babble on about next time, you're welcome to send me a message. And maybe I will be a little bit more organized at some point in the future. Okay? You guys are doing great. Bye.